You're listening to the Zipping Into Research podcast at the University of Akron.
All right. So thank you very much for joining us for our inaugural very first episode of Zipping Into Research, where we will be talking to various professors and researchers. We'll start in the College of Business and perhaps later on start touring around campus and see all the wonderful scholarship that's being done. And so today we're going to talk with Dr. Erin Makarius. I'm Dr. Federico De Gregorio, and
Hi, I'm Dr. Alexa Fox. We're associate professors in the Department of Marketing in the College of Business, and I'm the director of the Taylor Institute for Direct Marketing. And yes, we're very happy to have Dr. Erin Makarius, chair of the Department of Management, here with us today. She recently published a research article called You Say Goodbye and I Say Hello, the Alumni-Organization Relationship and Post-Separation Value in the Academy of Management Review. Congratulations on your recent publication, Erin.
Thank you.
And we're really glad to have you here today. So thank you for spending some time with us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Dr. Makarius, could you start by telling us about what you research overall and what motivates you to investigate these areas?
Sure. So I research people's relationships in organization and how that impacts work. And so this recent publication really focuses on relationships between alumni and organizations. And it really stemmed out of one of my co-authors in this area, Alison Dachner at John Carroll University. And I started research because we were alumni of the Fisher College of Business at Ohio State. And every year we really enjoyed reuniting with fellow alumni. So we actually started planning an annual Fisher family dinner at conferences. And we realized being a Buckeye was really part of who we were, even well after we had left the organization. And so as we were looking into relationships at organizations, we found that some companies had formal alumni programs, corporate alumni programs, where they maintain that relationship with their former employees, even after they had moved on to different jobs or different organizations. Other companies had ad hoc groups that were not managed by organizations, were kind of just former employees that band together. They used to work at McDonald's or Starbucks and had similar experiences. And so we wondered, what are the advantages of an organization taking ownership of an alumni program and maintaining that relationship in a more formal way with people that used to work for them? And what motivates employees to participate in alumni programs? And so that really began our journey into studying specifically the alumni organizational relationship and the value that that relationship could have for an organization.
okay, so let's kind of get into the actual research itself and kind of your conclusions and things like that. So, so basically, at the end of this process, what were your conclusions or propositions about this relationship?
Sure. So this was a conceptual paper. And so really what we were trying to do is build a theory for these types of relationships that organizations might maintain with their alumni. And so we introduced a new theory called post-separation value. And that really helps explain how former employees can help create, maintain, or even destroy value for the organizations in which they were a part of after they have left that formal employment. And so in this creation of this new theory, we really looked at the different types of value that could be created. So for one, we see that after people leave, alumni can be brand ambassadors. They can tell your story. They can really help people buy your product and really be advocates for the organization. They can help share knowledge. So being in a position for a long time, you gain a lot of information and knowledge about the way things work in that company, the way the job works. So maintaining that relationships helps keep some of that knowledge through that relationship. And they can actually help with talent acquisition. So they can refer other employees to the organization. Sometimes they come back as boomerangs and continue to work at that company. And another way they add value is through partnerships. So we saw organizations that had these alumni programs tended to have clients that were former employees or work through supply chain partnerships with people. So those relationships continued in different ways, but they still created value for the organization. Other companies really just didn't take advantage of the alumni program. So it was kind of a neutral value that nothing was happening with their alumni. They were focused on current employees. And sometimes when they did that, there was a missed opportunity that they could have had these advantages that by not having some sort of program, they were losing out on. And then another of organization outcome that we saw was negative values. So we found that organizations that either had a poor employee experience or people left on a sour note of that company saw the opposite effects of counterproductive behaviors. People acted as brand sabotages, saying, don't ever work for this company, going on Glassdoor and posting negative reviews, hoarding knowledge, so not being willing to share that knowledge, or even kind of brand sabotage of telling people don't buy that product or engage in that service with that organization. And so really we were looking at what was the pathway of how organizations could achieve more positive value and mitigate that negative value. And so what we found is that helping maintain these programs could lead to positive outcome for organizations, but also helped the alumni that had left them. So former employees were engaging in these networks because they found opportunities for career development, for networking, for knowledge growth of themselves, a lot of kind of industry knowledge sharing, future employment and partnership opportunities. So it was not only beneficial for the companies that had these programs, but also the alumni that were engaged in them. And so this was really a shift in the research on organizational relationships to move from what we consider the employee organizational relationship to the alumni organizational relationship. And so it's really looking at what are the unique features of that relationship? How can you maintain that relationship over time? So we see the corporate alumni programs in this new theory of really adding to research on human resources and talent management, of extending the type of programs that you have in an organization to really facilitate this process of career development and relationship building.
I think that's really interesting. As you were discussing it in the context of kind of the idea of an employee program that goes to an alumni program, I was thinking about in some of my own work with social media marketing. In my class, we talk a lot about employee-generated content. So when there's like a formal program in place or not, maybe they just encourage it informally at a company to encourage people to promote the business, promote what they do at work, those kinds of things. I was thinking about how it might be interesting, like even looking in a marketing context, as an alumni, would there be opportunities to really kind of foster some of that same type of content and encourage that content, alumni generated content or something? Maybe it wouldn't be a formal program in place, but it could be something where if you have these brand advocates, as you said, there would be opportunities to really kind of encourage that. And so I could even see how something like this could cross over into like a different discipline and look at maybe some marketing implications.
Absolutely. And the companies that we looked at that had these formal programs for alumni, the people that were leading them often came from marketing backgrounds, sometimes from human resources, sometimes from brand building or development in establishing relationships. And often that alumni spotlight was something that could be beneficial in mutual ways, that it benefited the organization, but also alumni felt that sense of recognition that I contributed to something great and I want to continue that relationship.
That's really interesting. So now a lot of these alumni programs, they tend to by default sound to me like something that they want to harness, that it's a positive thing. But as you pointed out, there are negative situations, right? This is basically a relationship breaking in a way, even though it's an employment relationship. And so many times, given the circumstances, the relationship is from the person who broke the relation is sometimes there's animosity, there's negativity. In one of your breakdowns of these categories, you called it the dead to me category. So in those cases, do you think the alumni program does not? So what do you think companies would do or should do in this situation where it's negative? The alumni program probably is not that appropriate for it. But so what is the goal? Do they basically say, okay, we're not going to acknowledge this, or do they actively address to try to mitigate and maybe part of the alumni program? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure, absolutely. Like a marketing strategy, you'd have tailored approaches for different groups, right? And so for alumni programs, you also have to think about these different alumni groups. And part of it is what was their employee experience like, and what's their experience as alumni? And so as you mentioned, there are these different groups that emerge from these two considerations. And so what we tended to see is that there were some employees that tended to be kindred spirits, that they had a lot of value as employees for you as an organization, but were also valuable to continue that relationship with, that they were likely to be your brand advocates or potential boomerangs that you wanted to keep engaged in case they're looking for a future job opportunity and you can bring them back into the organization. Some people were actually better as friends, that although they may have been valuable to you as an employee, they became even more valuable as an alumni. So it could be that they worked for a client organization or a supplier and you developed a continued relationship with them. And so you're going to manage that relationship differently than you would someone that, you want to kind of keep in that position and maintain that relationship as alumni rather than bringing them back as a boomerang. Others were kind of ones that got away, that maybe they were really valuable as an employee and you're sad to see them go, and they could engage in some of those negative behaviors after they leave. You mentioned the dead to me category of maybe they weren't that valuable as an employee and now they're the ones that are probably going out and likely sabotaging the brand or, leading to negative outcomes or negative value for the organization. So in having different approaches for a corporate alumni program, part of what you can do is change people's attitudes and behaviors. So even if they had a negative experience as an employee, there's a potential to re-engage them and get that feedback. And so through this process, one of the things we realize is the point of exit when people are leaving is really important, and that organizations don't pay enough attention to the offboarding process of that transition from employees to alumni.
This is even how it is with just personal relationships, I think, in a lot of ways, right? That point of exit, if something happens to make it so that it doesn't go right, you could easily fall into one of these more negative categories versus maybe a more kindred spirit or just better as friends. And I just think it's interesting because even people outside of a business context could probably relate to this just from a personal perspective.
Absolutely. Underlying all this research is theory on social exchange and psychology of relationships. So even the categories of the kindred spirits and dead to me, we took from the relationships literature and psychology. And so that really applies within the business setting as well.
So how does this work build on or maybe even contradict research that's been done on this topic, other types of research?
Absolutely. Well, the first step is that really there was a lack of awareness of this research area in general, that there hasn't been much research at all that has continued this issue. There's a lot of research in organizational behavior and human resources on turnover. And that research really considers why does an individual leave, that individual decision, and how can we retain employees? How do we keep them in the organization? So this kind of flips the script of saying, well, rather than a sole focus on how do we keep them here, it's what do we do after they leave and how do we maintain that relationship? Because we know not everyone is going to stay in an organization. And so we want to look for ways to continue to build upon the relationship that you invested so much time, energy, and money and energy while they were working there after they have left the organization. And so many companies aren't even aware that this is a possibility. And a lot of research in this area is really at the nascent stages. There has been some recent research on boomerang employees, on when employees come back into the organization. And what they find is that boomerangs tend to be more satisfied. They tend to go above and beyond in their role and kind of engage in these kind of extracurricular behaviors. And they typically have higher performance than external hires, the people that don't have experience with an organization. But that research is really focused on the re-entry process. And so our hypothesis or our theory is that paying attention to offboarding and alumni programs can help give that full circle of what leads people to be more likely to come back.
That's really interesting, especially now we're starting to hear the context of AI, that if people are being either replaced or their jobs are temporarily, being up, but then they're having some companies are hiring them back after they've realized oh, somebody needs to check what the AI, we can't rely solely on it to replace people completely. So now you hear there's been industry reports that bigger companies have let people go, but then rehire the same people to work with the AI originally. That's an interesting, and I guess, like you were saying, it depends on the circumstance of the boomerang, or how much gap there is between the time that happens. If it's short versus if it's a long time, so there's all kinds of interesting variables um, factors playing into there.
Well, and it points to the need to maintain that relationship from an organizational perspective, because what we do know from turnover research is that the way people are leave an organization matters. And so there's some interesting research on involuntary turnover and organizational justice. And so if you have to do layoffs in an organization, the process by which you carry those out matters for people's perceptions of that organization, their attitudes and their behaviors after they leave. So if you may want those people to come back in the future as boomerangs, then you want to pay more attention to that offboarding process and the alumni relationship.
Okay. So before I'm not following my script, but so, typically so maybe if our viewers hear about research, people generally tend to think of, oh, so research is someone collects data from somewhere. They ask someone something, they look at a data set, they do some analysis, and they report what they find, typically, basically. So your research was not as common, right? So it's conceptual only. It's theoretic. The theory paper establishing sort of groundwork and foundation for future research, really. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of research, why it's important, or why you chose to do that for this particular topic? Because you do all kinds of different methods of research.
Right. So for this topic, because it was so new and there wasn't much research to build upon, we really had to build the psychological underlings of why people might engage with alumni and think about those rationales. And so conceptual pieces allow you to think about what are those underlying reasons why people behave in certain ways and create frameworks that can help organizations and people operate in the future. And so by establishing this theory of post-separation value and alumni organizational relationships as a construct, this really leads the way for future research. And even now we're continuing to collect data and analyze it to determine what are these mechanisms by which organizations can engage with alumni to lead to positive value and mitigate or deter that negative value that could occur.
That's great. This is a really interesting study, and I'm glad to hear you're continuing your work in this area. We'll definitely be looking forward to kind of seeing what's next for that research. So I think we also want to kind of know a little bit about just a little bit more about you, just as a person. But before we do that, is there anything else that you would like to share with us regarding your work or kind of what's next, and maybe even what the implications are for businesses, policymakers, individuals, anything we didn't cover that you might want to share?
Sure, I'll talk a little bit about the application and then future research as well. So in terms of the application, I think this just really encourages organizations to start thinking about offboarding and alumni programs. And it can be a lot easier than you think. It can be starting small, thinking about the point of exit. A lot of people do exit interviews, but don't actually do anything with that data. And so really paying attention to the offboarding process and even thinking about a more proactive approach that can help people prepare for employee departures, that people might leave. How can you manage that relationship more proactively to help maintain long-term value? And so it's really thinking about, as a company, what are your goals? What are you trying to achieve? And what programs and initiatives do you currently have in place that might help you get there? And starting an alumni program can be pretty cost effective. That doesn't require a lot of investment, that you already have things like a HR information system that can be used to track resources and data and continue that relationship. And so our research is really not only on the application side, and we do have several publications in outlets like Harvard Business Review and Business Horizons that look at how can companies take the things that we've learned through our theory and data and apply them, but also really understanding this process from an organizational perspective and kind of shifting the mindset about mobility more broadly. So, for example, we think that there could be more of a climate for career mobility in organizations where companies think about having these honest career discussions with employees, recognizing that people might go somewhere else to achieve their career goals. And if so, how can you work with them while they're here as an employee and help them reach that next step in their career path? So really planning ahead for departures and thinking about how you can help people have these conversations. We also are examining the offboarding process in more detail to determine what are the steps companies can take that lead to more positive value. That point of departure is really important for setting the tone for that alumni organizational relationship. So looking at what practices or policies can lead to greater post-separation value. And then one of the other aspects that we're leaning into now is how can we learn from higher education? That there are companies, organizations that have been engaged in alumni for a long time. And so we're really digging into research and literature in those kind of organizations, colleges, universities that have established alumni programs. Consulting is another industry that really has led the way in terms of practices and processes for alumni. But what we're finding is that even these programs can be beneficial even for companies that have higher churn. So things like fast food or retail. So Starbucks and McDonald's are two examples of companies who have started to implement corporate alumni programs. And what they found is that even people that are working in their restaurants tend to have that knowledge and understand what it's like to be an employee. So they often come back to work for the corporate office and behind the scenes in the organization. So there's value in all types of organizations to maintain those relationships.
All right. So now we're sort of coming to towards the end of our session, but we like to close each sort of interview with what we tongue-in-cheek call wrapped. Researchers are people too, just to give people a sort of peek behind the person, behind the scholar and the teacher, and in your case, the department chair as well. So
I'm curious, Dr. Makarius, where is your very favorite place to be?
Well, of course, I love to be at home. I've got 4 children, and so I love to spend time with them. But if I had to pick one place, I think Hawaii would be the place I would spend all my time. It is the one vacation place that truly lived up to the expectations, and I really would have loved to be there all the time.
It's a great answer.
So in an alternate world, alternate universe, perhaps, if you couldn't be an academic, but you could be anything else, you just couldn't be that, what do you think you would be?
So I'm a pretty conscientious person. I actually made a spreadsheet of my career options before I went into academia. So this is a pretty perfect career in my opinion. However, if I had to choose something different, I've always been interested in the brain and neural networks. And so I think neuroscience would be something that, digging into cognition and how that impacts behavior. So yes, I'm a nerd at heart and proud of it.
To be a neuroscientist in Hawaii.
Yes.
Yes.
The ideal.
Yes.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much for joining us for our first episode of Zipping Into Research. It's been a pleasure getting to know you and your work more. And we're looking forward to kind of seeing what's next for you and your team.
Thanks for having me.